panel, and then they can just pass the ball to each other so we can hear their great content.
Do you want me to do a little introduction of the speakers, or were you going to do that, Kristen?
Whatever is most time efficient. We certainly, hopefully everyone had a chance to look in the, if you dialed in right above that, there we go. Oh, thank you so much.
That's beautiful.
That's yeah, so we certainly want everybody to understand how lucky we are to have this wonderful panel. And I'll just take a moment to introduce our three speakers and panelists. Dr. Kara Hall is the director of the Science of Team Science team and co-director of the Theories Project in the Science of Research and Technology branch, Behavioral Research Program at the National Cancer Institute, and will be our first panelist. And she'll be followed by Steve Fiore, who's the president of the Interdisciplinary Network for Group Research and faculty with the University of Central Florida's Cognitive Sciences Program in the Department of Philosophy and director of the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory at UCF's Institute for Simulation and Training. And then rounding out our great panel is Dr. Anthony Hood, who is the director of civic innovation in the Office of the President at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, and is also an associate professor in the management in the College School of Business. We're so fortunate to have you here. I'm going to turn this over to Kara. Each speaker is going to take about 10 to 15 minutes in sequence, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And I hope that we'll have a very robust one. So thank you. Take that one for last.
Just while we're switching screens, I'm going to remind people to mute their phones and also to tell everyone that this we're very, very fortunate that this presentation will be recorded. So we'll be able to share it later on, and we will archive it, but please know that as you ask questions, that they will be recorded.
Great, thank you. And it sounds like we still have some folks who might be able to mute for us. And otherwise, David, it might be possible for you to mute. So hopefully we could do that, and I'll get started. So I'm Kara Hall. I'm very happy to be here. I have just such a short time, so I'm going to give some highlights, and hopefully we can focus on specific interests of that some of you have as we get into the discussion. The discussion period. And so just to start, we all have opportunities to work in teams, particularly in our work that we do as scientists. And this slide just highlights the fact that there are a whole range of types of teams, unique profiles that come from thinking about a variety of dimensions that make up the way in which we can be engaging and working in teams. So, for instance, we might have two scientists who are working, maybe they are two chemists working in the same university, who are co-located in the same department, and so their goals may be more aligned, and the way in which they work together more consistent than if we have a group of 20 people who are working across the globe on a particular problem that might involve community stakeholders, scientists, people from industry, and so forth. And those folks then would have some differences in the particular angles that they might have in mind, or the way in which they typically work together. And so digging in a little bit further around the ways in which we can think about what influences our collaborations, we can think about collaboration as being complex, a lot like the type of scientific problems we're trying to address. And we can think about those from, for instance, an interpersonal perspective, where we might think about the fact that we might have colleagues who are more comfortable sharing their data or sharing their ideas. We might have colleagues who are successful at speaking with people from other disciplines by being able to articulate their ideas outside of the typical jargon from their discipline. we might have institutions that have tenure and promotion policies that align with doing work in a collaborative context. And so there's all sorts of things that we can think about that impacts the way in which we work together in teams. Thinking about all of these different levels and complex factors, we realized some years ago that although there had been a rich literature building over decades around groups and teams, trying to understand those, predominantly that had been done in teams in industry or military teams, and very little had been done in the context of science teams. And so colleagues and myself here at NCI started to think about, what is the value of doing team science, the way in which we were funding, for instance, large complex initiatives, center initiatives, things like the CTSAs. What are the team processes that help to maximize the way in which we work together to produce publications and innovative science, and so forth. So we launched this field in 2006 when we had a conference entitled The Science of Team Science, where we coined that phrase. And we were trying to understand how scientists were working together, particularly in this highly integrative fashion that we call transdisciplinary research. And myself and colleagues like Steve Fiore, who will be speaking next, have worked together on a variety of activities, including special journal issues or supplements, a yearly conference, the National Academy's consensus study that Steve and I had the honor of being on the committee for, and including a book that will be coming out this summer that we're very excited about. And so as we've been doing those activities, all of those have been really geared towards building the evidence around team science, promoting empirical studies and so forth. And those really are aimed at providing an evidence base for generating translational applications, so practical tools and strategies for supporting team science. And so things are have been emerging, and I'd love to share lots of information with you about that. But I try to include references throughout, since I don't have the opportunity to spend hours today. So moving on to sharing some highlights of what some of the empirical studies have found, and focusing on some of the outcomes, such as publications, that has been such a point of realm, a point of focus of the way in which we think about how we've been successful in doing our science, whether that's as individuals or teams. And when we look at the success of publications, the level of productivity, the impact, for instance, as measured by citation counts, what we find is that generally collaborations that span organizational and contextual boundaries, that those collaborations yield higher impact research. When we look at the diversity of teams with respect to disciplinary diversity, so multi, inter, and transdisciplinary collaboration, and we compare those, for instance, to unidisciplinary collaborations, what we find is the publication, more productivity in the teams that are producing those publications, more innovative products, greater scientific impact, broader reach across areas of science with the publications that are being produced, and so forth. And so here's an example of a study myself and colleagues conducted some years ago, looking at the productivity of our transdisciplinary research centers, one in particular, the Transdisciplinary Tobacco Use Research Centers. And what we're trying to do is look at the productivity of publications over a 10-year period of time and compare that to matched R01 sample, so our traditional investigator-driven project. And what we found was that in the first 3 or 4 years, our transdisciplinary teams were had a bit of a lag in their productivity. But once the teams got their kinks worked out, their collaborations really started to take off. And so what we see is in the later years in an acceleration of the productivity by these teams. Some interesting findings that Cummings and Kiesler found when they looked at about 500 NSF-funded projects. Their findings at first glance look perhaps counter to the findings that I just shared with you. What these graphs show is that as the number of investigators on a team increases and the number of disciplines increases, what we find is a degradation, a little bit of a degradation of effect for that increasing number of investigators and disciplines, and a similar pattern is found for projects that have a large number of investigators and an increasing number of institutions. What's really interesting about their findings was that one of the core mediators of that degradation of effect was coordination mechanisms. So what they found was that the projects that used more coordination mechanisms had more successful outcomes. And what's interesting is that the greater the number of the universities that were involved in these projects, the fewer the coordination mechanisms that they were using, and following that, fewer project outcomes. So this is really highlighting how important coordination is, and using these mechanisms to make sure that when you have a complex collaboration, that you are equally accounting for the communication and coordination needs that go along with that. Another interesting finding that they had was that, when budgets got cut, what they found was that the first thing that was cut in those projects with funding being cut was that they were cutting the coordination mechanisms. And so that's something that we all, from an agency perspective and from those of you leading teams, is to be thinking about the implications of those kinds of changes to the way in which you're moving forward on a project. Myself and colleagues, we've done a whole array of studies and taking a stock of the work that's been done in the sites community more broadly. Overall, we see when we're looking at these kind of outcomes is greater integration when we have teams working across disciplines. When we have structures to support those teams, we see increases of collaborations across centers, across levels of analysis. We see enhanced reach and so forth. And so, as we start digging into those findings, what we see is, when we have opportunities to mitigate some of the cultural and structural barriers that exist, we're able to really bolster the success of the collaboration and the science that's coming out of that. We also, in the sites field, continuing to try to feed that evidence into some practical applications, some strategies, conceptual models. We're continuing to provide more and more tools for guiding the work being done in teams. And so I just have about 1 or 2 minutes, so I'm just going to quickly highlight a conceptual model that myself and colleagues developed called the 4-phase model of transdisciplinary research. And this was really developed to try to give a heuristic, a roadmap for thinking about key team processes. So when we look at the literature in the science of teams, there's a huge number of really important processes, and sometimes that's a bit overwhelming to think about how to deal with and incorporate all of those to enhance your collaboration. So I'll go quickly through these. Steve is going to highlight some of these processes in his talk, so I'll just kind of foreshadow those. Part of the idea around breaking the research down into these phases, from an agency perspective, I think we're often not supporting this development phase as well as we could. Think about doing interdisciplinary work. It really requires people to take some time up front to think about all of the factors that could be taken into account, the different disciplines and experts who could be brought in to weigh in on those. And so the development phase is really thinking about what the problem space is. And, at this time, you're going to have people coming together and wanting to think about shared mission and goals, things like externalized group cognition. That's really just this graphic represents that, putting things down on paper for people to react to and have conversations around as you're trying to really get a shared understanding of what you're trying to do. And I know Steve will talk about psychological safety. In the conceptualization phase, here's where if the last one is the sandbox, which is, what's the sandcastle that we're going to build.
Hello?
And, this is where we're thinking about actually developing the proposal that would go in and together as a group as you're doing that, really getting clear on using these externalized group cognition to develop shared mental models, the shared language, and so forth. And then in the implementation stage, here's where you're actually, you've gotten the grant and you're going to launch the work that you're doing. And at this point, you really want to be able to understand who knows what, who does what, and how things get done. And then the last phase, the translation phase, once you have some findings, you might be wanting to, for instance, move an intervention into a community, and at that point, you will be thinking about bringing in new team members to your team, and at this point, it's an opportunity to think about, how might the shared goals shift, and how can you continue to move through those processes to make sure that as the team is evolving, you're continuing to optimize your ability to work together. And so I am going to end there. These are just some resources. The Team Science Toolkit is a place where you can find all of the things that were highlighted in this presentation. We have our annual conference, and we have a listserv that you can register for through the Team Science Toolkit. So thank you. So I realized I stopped
That was
sharing.
terrific. That was a terrific presentation. While you switch screens, you have the time you need. We don't mean to rush you. This is such a rich presentation, and you'll have the time that you need. I know that people are just riveted by it, as I am. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
So Steve, you might still be on mute.
Okay, can everyone see screen?
Oh, there you go. Yep, you're all.
Thank
we can
you.
hear you now.
Got 3 different controls going on here. Okay, so like Tara said, I'm going to dig into a little bit about some of the team processes, but Kristen has specifically asked that I talk about some of the research gaps in the science of team science. And there are quite a few gaps associated with the science of team science. So we're kind of been framing this around broader research issues to try and identify what factors are necessary for effective teamwork. So we're drawing largely on the science of teams more broadly, and we're looking at what we know about teamwork from other domains and thinking the degree to which it's applicable to scientific collaboration, but also trying to determine what we need to know about science teams that are different from other teams in other kinds of domains in industry, for example. And this has both theoretical and practical significance. From the theoretical side, it's going to inform our understanding about the scientific ecosystem and how knowledge is produced. But from the practical standpoint, it's going to help us improve the science of team science. So that's really this kind of complementarity or duality to what we're trying to achieve with the development of the science of team science. And what we mean by that is we want to improve existing science, and we want to do that by looking at teamwork, studying teamwork, taking what we know about teams and applying it to facilitate collaboration. And Karen mentioned this idea of coordination mechanisms. So to what degree can we improve science more generally in the short term, but also the long-term goal is really to understand the production of knowledge, and that's essentially what scientists do. They solve very complex problems. They create new knowledge, which are these solutions. So we want to achieve both of these goals, and this is just a small sampling of the kinds of research issues that we need to address in order to achieve these goals. So one important distinction that I wanted to highlight is this difference between task work and teamwork. And this is an idea that was developed in the science of teams more generally a number of years ago. And this came out of the training literature. And what they realized is that when you train people on complex team tasks, you're not simply training them how to do their job, that is the task work, you also need to train them on the teamwork itself. And you can think about this in the context of science because most scientists, or just about all scientists, spend years and years being educated on how to do their task. And what we mean by that is you're learning how to become a scientist. So you're learning the particular theories, you're learning the methods, you're learning the concepts, you're learning how to write as a scientist. That's what we refer to as the task work. What we're never taught, what we never learn, is how to be a team scientist. So we're never specifically thought about the teamwork and the collaboration process and what it takes to be a functioning member of an interdependent team. So this has to do with the attitudinal, behavioral, and cognitive factors associated with teamwork. So this is the affect arising from working in teams. These are the skills you need when working in a team, and there's the knowledge associated with working in a team. So that's what I'm going to dive in a little bit more about those. And here's this heuristic, the ABCs of teamwork as we refer to it. We use this heuristic to try and capture and categorize these processes and these competencies that people need to be an effective member of a team. So we call it the ABCs because there's this affective or attitudinal component, there's a behavioral component, and there's a cognitive component. And this kind of captures the way psychologists think about humans more generally, but we also think about teams in a similar way. That is, teams think, teams feel, and teams do. So I want to point out that there are any number of concepts that fit within these broad categories, and researchers in the area of teams, they study these specific concepts, and they can spend their entire career just studying one of these concepts, and many people do, and some people look across these attitudinal behavior components, so they want to see the degree to which a team cohesion is related to things like shared mental models in those teams. But the larger point I wanted to make here is we need to pursue a better understanding of the attitudinal, behavioral, and cognitive components of teamwork in science teams, because we really don't have a good understanding of how these processes play out in the context of scientific collaboration. So this is a busy slide, but I wanted to illustrate probably one of the more robust team attitudes that has come out of the literature. And this is the idea of psychological safety. This is a concept that Amy Edmondson developed a number of years ago. It's a really robust phenomena from the standpoint of it has been shown to play out in a number of different domains. And the way to think about this is just imagine you're in a science team meeting. And in that meeting, no one's voicing their opinions. People are afraid to discuss or debate ideas. They're just simply going along with what the PI is saying. And we all know, we can reflect on that and say that's really a bad model for science. And we know that good scientific teams actively debate, argue about ideas. They bounce their ideas off each other. They work to help solve the issues. And they do this through this kind of constructive conflict. And in order to do that, though, you need this idea of psychological safety. So this is the belief that you'll not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with members of your team. You're going to be able to freely express your concerns. You can be comfortable with making mistakes on that team. And what we know from studies of psychological safety is that teams make more mistakes, and they're more successful when they make these mistakes. They're comfortable with taking risks, and this is really a key to innovation. And this idea of psychological safety hit the press a number of years ago, or just a few years ago, because Google invested a significant amount of time and effort to study their own team. So here you have one of the most well-known high-tech companies in the world studying their team process and performance. And they specifically wanted to know what distinguished good teams from poor teams in Google. And it was really interesting because Google went into this study with the mindset that what would matter is the people on the team, that is the compositional factors of the team. What they found, though, was what mattered was the process engaged by those teams. And the processes that they found that mattered most was this idea of psychological safety. So the teams that were most effective all had in common the sense of comfort, the sense of risk-taking, the sense of being able to speak your mind, sticking your neck out without fear of having it cut off. And those of us who study teams, we kind of know that this is a genuine phenomenon. We know that process really will trump a number of other factors. And when you can inculcate this idea of psychological safety on a team, people are comfortable with taking risks. And this matters in science teams because in a lot of the complex problems we're trying to solve, you are taking a risk. You're putting out hypotheses that may not pan out, and you need to be comfortable with doing that. You need to be comfortable with taking these risks because that's how science progresses. So from the standpoint of furthering our understanding in the science of team science, we really need to understand how to develop psychological safety in science teams that have a diverse group of members. So what we mean by diversity here is not simply the kind of demographic diversity, but we have diversity of disciplines and diversity of rank in these science teams. And it's critical that, for example, the junior members of a team, even the graduate students, are comfortable speaking up when you have a senior member of a team, and they should be comfortable disagreeing with members of those teams, because that's really, again, how knowledge gets finely honed, and that's how science progresses. So when it comes to behaviors, one of the key behaviors is going to be communication and interdisciplinary communication competencies. And there's a number of specific kinds of communication competencies. I'm just highlighting a small set. One is this idea of active listening. And it may seem simple to say, but it's really an important competency that I don't think enough of us practice. And that's really just sitting and listening and carefully attending to what people are saying. And you want to be comfortable in that setting and asking for clarification and listening for ambiguity and being comfortable saying that I need you to repeat that. And this is listening to learn and understand, and listening to contribute and integrate to the kinds of problem solving that these teams engage in. Another idea associated with communication is this notion of super tuning. And this is a unique one that came out of social psychology a number of years ago. And this has to do with tailoring your message specifically for the receiver. This is critical to interdisciplinary and interprofessional teams because we do not all speak the same language. So we'll have the same terms that mean different things. We'll have different terms that mean the same things. You need to be cognizant of it. You need to have this kind of theory of mind where you can understand what your teammates understand and tune your message appropriately. So you need to not simply express yourself clearly, but you need to express yourself to people from different disciplines so you avoid jargon and you convey the ideas in a way that people from other disciplines and professions will understand. And then finally, there's this idea of assertive communication, and this really has to do with standing up for your ideas and opinions, and this is addressing conflict in a purposeful way. This really matters in interdisciplinary teams because whether we like it or not, there's a pecking order across the disciplines, and some disciplines look down on other disciplines. So if you're trying to solve a complex interdisciplinary problem, you need to make sure that everyone on that team, that is everyone from the different disciplines, has a voice. They have a say in the development of the particular form of science in which they're engaged. So assertive communication is a kind of behavior that needs to be learned, it needs to be practiced. And we're really still at the early stages of developing the kind of communication training for science teams. So I wanted to put forth this one as an area needing further exploration. And then finally, there's this idea of team cognition. And there's many different ways to think about team cognition. Kara talked about developing a problem space. She talked about shared mental models. So one of the ubiquitous ideas in team cognition is this notion of shared mental models or transactive memory systems. And what that means is good teams know who knows what. Good teams have shared understanding of the problem that they're facing. They have shared understanding of the environment in which they're operating. They have shared understanding of the roles that each member of the team has. And with that, that facilitates coordination. So transactive memory systems are a specific kind of shared mental model that has to do with knowing who knows what. So it has to do with the team-related knowledge, the roles the teammates play, their particular forms of expertise, and they use this understanding to facilitate coordination. So they know, for example, if a statistics problem comes up, they know who to go to. Or if there's a technical issue that comes up, they know who to go to. If there's a theoretical issue that comes up, they know which member of the team on which to rely. So team cognition research is still very active in the study of collaboration more generally, and it's exciting to see this now unfolding more in the study of science teams. And so just to wrap up, I think that the policy and research community needs to themselves more actively collaborate to identify how to develop the funding mechanisms that will allow us to study the relationship of the attitudinal, behavioral, and cognitive factors within scientific collaboration, because that's really the only way we're going to make progress in improving the scientific ecosystem. And if you're interested in understanding more about teams in general, Kara did mention the Science of Team Science Conference, but we also have the Interdisciplinary Network for Group Research, which is a collection of scholars who study groups and teams across a number of different domains. And our conference is this summer in Lisbon, and the Michigan Conference for the Science of Team Science is just a few short weeks away. So I will end it there and see if I can hand off. Anthony, I didn't see your name on the list. Is anyone else able to hand off to Anthony for me?
If not, I think I see a thing that says share my screen. I can see if I can share it. Can you guys hear me?
Yep. Looks like you're in process still.
Okay. Okay. You guys can hear me and see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Quick question. How much time do I have?
I believe you were slotted for 10 minutes.
Okay, great. I joined the call late. I'm on Central Time, so I thought I had 30 more minutes before I needed to log on to the call. So I just wanted to be clear about how much time that I have. But I thank you guys for joining into the call today. I'm sure my colleagues talked a lot about the field of team science and the science of team science. So I won't repeat or regurgitate that. I think what I'm going to focus on more particularly is the practical aspects of team science, and particularly the work that I've been doing at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, as it relates to training our scientists, our professionals, our researchers, as well as our students, and how to really collaborate and engage effectively, not only on campus, but also off campus into our community. So just a little bit about myself. I'm the Director of Civic Innovation in the Office of the President. That is a role that's particularly focused on community and economic development in the city of Birmingham and the state of Alabama. From a research standpoint, I do research on team dynamics, particularly things like conflict, communication, transactive memory, and psychological safety, many of the same things that my colleagues have talked about a little bit today. I want to show just a quick video of my approach to doing training on team science. And hopefully you can see this. I don't know if you can hear it as well. But essentially what you see here is really just a clip of some of the team science training that I do I have some lessons learned from what I've been doing as it relates to training on team science. One of the things that I realize is that when you're dealing with scientists, when you're dealing with trainees and things like that, it's important to have active learning to make it engaging. I typically get people up, walking around, engaging with each other. If you can see this screen in the back, this is actually figure 1 from one of my research papers that looked at the overlap of conflict and friendship within teams. So essentially what I do is have them, I break them up into small groups, and I have them decide which of these team structures do they think would lend themselves to the highest levels of team effectiveness. And this is usually about halfway into my presentation, where I've kind of told them about conflict and teamwork and psychological safety. And so I have them kind of apply the things that I've trained them in selecting which of these teams they think will have the highest level of team performance. So they have to nominate a spokesperson in their team and actually kind of talk us through their rationale. Often what happens is they will report that they actually had conflict within their small groups about which teams lend themselves to the highest levels of performance. Typically the trainings that I do, what I found a good time is about an hour. Anything less than an hour is probably too short, and probably longer than that, you probably need to put into maybe like a 4-hour half-day workshop or a full workshop. Also, the workshops that I do, I typically embed them in existing programming. So at UAB, we have an NCAT center. Our center is called the Center for Clinical and Translational Science, or what we call CCTS. And so we have, year-long programming, and essentially what we do is we include a module on team science as one of the modules in this year-long process. We've also embedded them in some of our summer research training, our enrichment programs for high school and undergraduate students. We also do this for some of our postdocs and some of our case scholars who are working on getting into scientific roles. So what we found is that embedding these in existing programming tends to make sure that we have a captive audience and making sure that we're reaching people, particularly some of our junior researchers and faculty members, hitting them where they need it the most before they get too far along into their careers. I typically have patterned the training that we do around the NAS report on enhancing the effectiveness of team science, which I know has been mentioned earlier. So essentially these are some of the things that I have drawn upon. These are the recommendations of what we need to do to enhance team science, and this is essentially what our training actually touches on. I'll also tell them about some of the trends in scientific research that came from that report. And then I also make sure that at the beginning of the training, I make sure that we're all clear on the same definition of a team. And it's always interesting. I always open my trainings with, so who in here works on a team? And it's interesting, sometimes people will say, well, I don't work in a team. And so sometimes you have to unpack that, like, well, do you work by yourself in an office by yourself? Like, no, there are other people there. Like, okay, do you have to collaborate? Does your output make up somebody else's input? So that gives me an opportunity to bring in this definition from the report and help them understand that as long as you have two people, you have the basis for a team. I teach them about interdependence, common goals, and things like that. Then what I do is I tell them about some of the resources that are on campus. We have a big focus at UAB on simulation, particularly amongst our practitioners as well as our scientists, because there's a lot of collaboration between those two sides of campus. And so making sure that people are comfortable working with people who are outside of their particular domain. So whether it's somebody in pharmacy or nursing or even arts and sciences and business, making sure that they understand that people have different motivations for engaging in team-based science or team-based practice, and making sure that you uncover those motivations and perform effectively. I'll skip ahead in the interest of time. I teach them about interdisciplinarity, and I teach them the differences between interdisciplinary teams versus transdisciplinary teams. We talk a big focus on diversity and how diversity is a great thing, and where you have diversity, you're going to have conflict. And what I found in doing these trainings is that conflict is a huge opportunity area, I think, all across campus. Everybody's having conflict. Nobody really wants to talk about it. We find that there's a lot of avoidance of conflict on campus. So this has become a much bigger focus on what we do on campus. So I teach them about the 4 primary sources of conflict: task, relationship, process, and goal conflict. I help them understand that if you're having a disagreement, it is really important to make sure that you're identifying what type of conflict we're having. And particularly because I'm talking to health-related professions, I usually tell them that if you can't properly diagnose the type of conflict you're having, it's probably going to be very difficult in order for you to prescribe the right care plan in order to resolve that conflict effectively. And so I think when I put it in those terms, I think it's received very well. So I help them understand what are these different types of conflict and how they engage in the appropriate levels of conflict resolution strategies to be able to resolve those conflicts. We talk about the contagion of conflict. This is some work from Karen Jen and her colleagues that looked at conflict as almost like a virus, and how oftentimes conflicts will begin between 2 people, and then they will ultimately spread to infect other people within the team if we're not careful about resolving those conflicts when they initially come up. And then I talk about the overlap of conflict with friendship and how there could be a dark side to workplace friendships, helping them understand that oftentimes when you are very close and intimate relationships with other people when you're working on projects, that may lead to ineffective or suboptimal conflict management strategy. So this is one of the diagrams that I utilize in order to have like a quick 10, 12-minute type of exercise where I get people up, break them up into small groups, and have them decide which of these types of network structures will lend themselves to high levels of team performance. One of the big focus of the presentation as well is on psychological safety. I bring in the work that Google did to try to identify what is the correlates of high-performing teams, and what they found was that teams that have psychological safety tend to outperform teams that have low levels of psychological safety. So everything that we do, we make sure that we're grounding it in the literature, but also making it practical. So we talk about psychological safety, we talk about the types of behaviors that put people at interpersonal risk, and how we need to create a psychologically safe environment for people to engage in the type of behaviors that we know will lead to high levels of or even illegal, or may lead to an unsafe practice that may jeopardize the health of the organization or the health of a patient or somebody else in the organization. And then help them understand that there are constructive types of conflict, and we need to make sure that we create an environment where people feel comfortable challenging, questioning, and vetting solutions and decisions that may come up. And we need to do that without concern for people feeling devalued, having their words distorted, or their expertise being discounted. Because these are things that, if they're not in place, they're much more likely to make transactive memory system development hard to develop. And kind of landing this plane, that is another focus of the presentation that I give is transactive memory. One of the underlying methods of transactive memory is developing associations between the tasks that the team is working on, the expertise of the team members, and the actual people who are on the team. And so this is one of these handouts that I give to participants to show them you need to identify who's in the team, what tasks need to be done, and make sure those are aligned with the proper levels of expertise within the team. And sometimes you may realize we don't have the expertise necessary on the team to perform effectively, so we may need to go out, recruit that expertise, or to encourage other people within the team to develop that expertise. And in doing that, then we're in a much better place to develop.
Anthony, are you still talking? We can't hear you. Anthony? We seem to have lost you. Okay. Anthony, are you there?
Symbol on his.
Oh.
it looks like his connection is not functioning.
Okay. Liz, I guess we're ready for the answer and the question period.
All right, it looks like everyone has come off mute, so we've got a lot of feedback going on, but we do want to have questions, at least for our first two speakers, and hopefully Anthony can join us.
We got this in 20 later. Okay.
14 minutes. You be done? Oh. So any for our speakers? Okay. We have a question here.
My question for Steve. Steve, you actually talk about. I wrote it. I conflict leads to innovation. Is that what you said? I wrote down.
David, could you centrally mute everyone, and then we'll have her ask the question again.
Okay, I've muted everyone.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Everyone is muted now. It was that Margaret Barton Burke who was asking the question. You can go ahead if you're the person asking the question. Oh, Rosemary White Trout. You can go ahead and just unmute yourself, and we'll take your question again.
I didn't have a question.
Okay, then who again? Whoever was asking the question, or Kristen, if you want to unmute yourself here it was you and Margaret. Can you and Margaret unmute yourself and just ask the question again?
Yep. Sorry. This is a question for Steve. My question has to do with you said something about comfortable conflict leads to innovation. And I think I got it wrong by calling it comfortable conflict, but I found that very fascinating, the concept of having conflict that then leads to innovation. And I do believe in it, but I was wondering if you could explain it a little bit better and also give me the correct terminology. Steve, you have to unmute yourself.
Steve, you'll need to manually unmute yourself to answer.
Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Perfect.
Okay. So conflict is, this is related to what Anthony was just discussing when he was outlining the different forms of conflict. So it's a deceptively complex construct, and you can simply break it down into two dimensions. There's task-focused conflict and interpersonal or team-focused conflict as probably the highest level of categorization. So task-focused conflict is the more constructive or good form of conflict. That's the one where you're debating ideas, you're discussing what people have shared about their perspective on an issue, and you're working through the different kinds of perhaps it's methods or research questions one might to pursue. So it's arguing about those that are the productive ways science advances, because you're finally honing in and you're sharpening what those ideas are by arguing over them. And that's, again, focusing on the specific task. It's not focusing on the people. It's not the kind of interpersonal relationship conflict that comes to mind whenever people use the word conflict. So that's where the distinction starts when you talk about how conflict leads to innovation.
Yeah, and just building on.
Yeah, and I think Anthony outlined a lot of that as well. Does somebody else have additional comments or questions? I don't know if you were able to hear me before, because I think I myself was on mute, but this has been an absolutely fantastic session. Like, people are emailing me already about slides and recordings and watching it again and taking notes, and so you guys were incredible. This was a fabulous panel. Does anyone else have questions or comments?
Hi, this is hello, can you hear me? This is Linda Roussel. I have a question.
Yep. Go ahead, Linda.
I have a question relative to like how long a team has been together and some strategies in terms of like a new team versus maybe a mature team, and also the online versus like face-to-face in terms of teams that work collaboratively. Any speaker could answer.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Okay. So you're talking about new teams versus teams with a history of collaboration, and there's some research that shows actually a combination of having team members that have worked together previously with new members joining in offers a team that has the potential for some high functioning processes while bringing in new ideas and so spurring innovation. And so the idea there is that teams that continue to work together oftentimes have worked out the ways in which they're going to work together, the expectations, the trust. But if they continue to work together for a long period of time without adding new members, then the idea of groupthink or more slow and iterative advances can sometimes be made in that way. So that's sort of thinking about a wholly new, this combination. With respect to then having new folks come together, there's really a lot of tools and things you can think about to helping launch a new team. Things like our former NIH ombudsman had developed something called a prenuptial collaborative agreement. And really what this is a series of questions that you can sit down at the beginning of a collaboration and talk about with your new collaborators. Things like, how are we going to handle authorship? What happens if one of us moves institutions? How frequently are we going to meet? What is our expectation for how quickly we'll respond to requests and so forth? So those are the kinds of there's sort of structured tools to help facilitate building up some of that trust to create conflict prevention so that you can avoid some of the conflict management that might have to happen with a new team without those things.
We probably have time for one more question for the panel. And I just want to say that, again, Kristen from Memorial Sloan Kettering organized this incredible panel around a topic that she was interested in reaching out to. And I'm going to invite everyone on the call who has a specific topic like this that they'd like to learn more about, the opportunity to be in touch with experts in the field by organizing a panel such as this one, which was outstanding. I'm going to go ahead and take one more question if we have it, if somebody has one, and then we will. You can email me for the recording, and if you are you guys available? Are you willing to share your slides to the presenters? Is that okay? Okay. So is there one more person with a question?
Hi, this is Rachel. I don't have a question, but I want to thank all the presenters. And I just want to say that building teams is not an easy task and it's not a quick fix. So you have to be really willing to invest some time and energy and sometimes some resources into this in order to make them really successful as a team, or to decide that they are not going to be able to work as a team. So thank you for all the great advice. Here at UW Milwaukee, we've had the pleasure of having Steve come and do a workshop for us and another webinar. So we've learned a lot, and we thank you for this great presentation.
Yeah, I would agree, and we may we may ask you guys to come back again and update us on some of this work, because I really think it was something that much of this information was, I think, new to people on the call. So we genuinely appreciate the opportunity to have learned several new and critically important things today. So with that, I want to thank Kristen Fessel for organizing this panel and our amazing presenters. We will follow up with the presenters with just the what this call is and how many people attended and the request for your slides and all that. So this has been fantastic. Rachel, I don't know, or David, do you want to say anything, or Kristen, do you, just to the committee itself?
Just adding my thanks and appreciation. And yes, this is new content for a lot of us. It's very inspiring, and I think it's going to help us to think in higher level sorts of ways about this issue. So thank you for participating, and thanks to all who attended and asked great questions.
Yeah, and it was just in time for many of us who are about to embark on doing this work. So just a fantastic just-in-time experience. So thank you very much. We will return everyone to their day. And again, thank you to our presenters. And we will talk soon. We'll see you in 1 month from today for Implementation and Dissemination Science. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.